This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan. I am here with Dr. Cory Clark, who is affiliated right now with the University of Pennsylvania. Cory, can you tell the people out there a little bit about yourself, what you're interested in, how you define yourself, what you identify it as, and what your pronouns are?
I identify as a tiger. My name is Cory. I guess I'm technically a social psychologist, but I call myself a behavioral scientist because social psychology, the reputation has plummeted over the past 10 to 15 years. But that's what my Ph.D. is in. I'm at University of Pennsylvania in the psychology department and management department. And I'm the executive director of the Adversarial Collaboration Project, which is a sort of science reform initiative where we're trying to get enemy science to collaborate with each other rather than write mean replies to one another's work and call each other assholes at conferences.
Yeah, at the tail end of this, I might want to talk a little bit about that and how science works in the United States, how it's going to work in the future, how it doesn't work, and that's an interesting topic for scientists in particular. So I'll get to that at the end because I think there's a lot of normies out there don't really care. They're just showing me the results.
Yeah.
Is it true or not? That's what I
don't hear
do
the philosophy of science bullshit.
No. But so actually, let me ask before we get to the paper that I want to talk about with you.
Mm-hmm.
What is up with social psychology? Why was it in particular of the fields in psychology vulnerable? Why do you think it was vulnerable to the replication crisis and all those things?
Well, some people, the pro-social psych folk would say, well done, social psychologists, we figured out our own mistakes and are cleaning up our own mess. And other disciplines have replication crisis issues too, which is all true. However, in the handful of other fields, people have looked at replication issues in other disciplines. It does seem like social psychology is particularly terrible. And my best guess for why that is because the whole concept of social psychology might be a false positive in that the things that social psychologists love to do is manipulate these little teensy tiny environmental things that last a second or 5 seconds, and it has some radical change on some really important outcome. People are more ambitious, they're happier, they're kinder, or they're more aggressive. And I think those kinds of effects, or you put someone in a particular mindset and then they do better in school. These little teensy tiny low cost interventions that social psychologists love to do, I think most of them are bullshit. And so it was sort of inevitable that eventually we were going to figure out that none of these little things worked. And instead, a lot of the correlational stuff replicates. And that's the kind of stuff that social psychology thought it was too good for.
Well, and I do have to say, correlational and the nudges and all these other things, behavioral economics, which was a massively sexy field right after the financial crisis in particular, where there was all these ideas that, the economists are wrong because, they use a rational actor model and we have all these cognitive biases. And that field is having a massive comeuppance. The woman at Harvard, Italian background,
Francesco Gino.
Yeah, radioactive, it's going to destroy the field. She's on so many papers. And now Dan Ariely is they're coming after him again the second time. And so with Ariely, some of you might know him from his media production. He used to be on NPR and stuff all the time. He wrote Predictably Irrational, and then he wrote a book about lying. And it turns out that almost certainly some of the data that he has used, insurance data and stuff, was fabricated. Now, the question is, whether he's responsible or not responsible. There is a real thing in some of these fields where the original data does get lost or deleted. That does happen, you
I
know?
think APA guidelines was like 10 years you have to hang. I mean, now I think the normal practice is to hang on to it forever. But when
Yeah.
people were holding on to paper surveys, collecting dust in the storage unit, I think people said 10 years. So, like, that's all plausible. But those findings, even though maybe they would call themselves a different discipline, that's social psychology kind of stuff. These little
Yeah.
manipulations, sign at the beginning, sign at the end, and it has these big changes for honesty. Like, those are all social psychology type findings, and those are the type of findings that don't replicate. And if you're going to be a successful scientist who's publishing those kinds of findings, you might feel compelled to cheat because you can't get them to work and you got to publish papers. So even the fraud cases, I don't think most scientists did that level of, that's not even p hacking at that point, but they didn't engage in that. But
I think we call it pulling a staple.
Pulling a staple?
Like Diedrich Staple.
I think that's Staple.
Okay, whatever. We live in America. Yeah, we live in America, and if English is good enough for Jesus Christ in the Bible, it's good enough for me, So, but yeah, whatever. That guy, he literally made up data sets when people were thinking about how do we explore this, and he's like, I have a data set, and then he would go home and make it. And so, that's doable. And
I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but it was pretty rare.
Well, so there's a guy, I think he's an immunologist that just came out. I mean, this is everywhere. Like, when the replication crisis hit, a lot of people are saying, like, it's like in biomed, in farm, there's massive issues, And a guy, checked some immunology, some immunologist, I think, checked a bunch of papers, and wherever he found the raw data, he said that there was 25% fraud or massive error that was basically just invalidates the paper, Well, that's a lot. When he only found summary statistics, he could only find fraud or invalidate the paper in 1% of the time when they didn't report all the data.
I see.
So he's concluding from that, no, it's not that those people have better data. It's that they're not reporting the data, and so you can't even confirm that.
We can't know.
Probably 25% of those cases, you can't really confirm that it's fraudulent or it's in error.
Right. I mean, most people who committed fraud would probably try to destroy their data to minimize their chances of getting caught. So that's why it's sort of surprising to me that some people who were committing fraud still went ahead and made their data publicly available. It's pretty bold.
You know what? When you're that big, they let you. No, but I mean, that's kind of I don't want to, I'm not, okay, this is not libelous, but I mean, it's just if Dan Ariely was not Dan Ariely, if he was not a very prominent, professor at Duke, if he was junior faculty or if he was a grad student or something like that, he would have been done a long time ago.
Well, maybe or maybe not, because I think people like to target high status people because people like to see the high status people tumble. If that paper had been published in a journal no one cared about, then no one would have bothered double checking it because they wouldn't have been jealous.
Wait, was your psychologizing there? Is that a robust model? I mean, has that been replicated?
No, that's an intuition. That's a series of anecdotal experiences.
No, but that's a fair enough point. Also, and people that have been in situations where they've been touched by fraud, they're paranoid after that too. Because I've known of people that were in collaborations and then they found out something about their collaborator and they freaked out. So I'm going to move on to the paper, but I will tell a quick anecdotal story. I think I've told this before, but anyway, I'm not sure if I have on this podcast, but this just, stuff happens in science, and I'm not trying to make science seem bad, but it's weird. So I have a friend, and he ended up getting a postdoc in the European Union. I'm not going to say at what institution. And it was a great opportunity, supposedly. And then he's in the lab, and he realized they're fudging things all the time. And he's asks his mentor in the lab, not the primary investigator, not the scientist that's leading. It's I think something's going on here. And the guy looked at him. He's like, wait, you didn't know that we just made stuff up? and my friend was like, wait, what? He's like, oh, everyone knows we make stuff up in this lab. And
What?
yeah, and it was a big PI. It was a big lab.
Did they ever get busted?
I don't think so, but the story doesn't end there. And so they just assumed that he knew he was okay with the fraud, and that's why he joined. He had moved out of field. I guess I can say it's a plant lab. He wasn't a plant person.
Okay.
Anyway,
not even the plants are replicating.
Yeah, I don't want to give too many details because I don't want to be sued. But so he eventually had to leave, but he didn't narc because they were like, your career will be destroyed. What you need to do is make a pretense why you have to leave the EU. And so he did. It was a family emergency, so he left, and then he got another postdoc somewhere else, and he's fine. But I was like, what? I was like, that is crazy. And he's like, yeah, but everybody knows. Everyone in the field knows, but this person's publishing. And then later, I was hanging out with a friend of mine, and she was at that same institution in the same field, different organism, but whatever. And I was like, so-and-so, I'm just gonna make up a name that's generic, but that sounds like him. Mike told me that postdoc, that lab he was in, and she was like, oh yeah, the one that produces fraudulent data. And I was like, wait, what? And so it's a big professor, and everyone knows. It's kind of like an open secret, I guess. And nobody wants to call out this person because it will destroy. There's a coordination problem. I think I've told this story.
Surely someone is competitive enough with this PI that they would be happy to watch him or her go down.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe it has happened. This happened 10 years ago.
Okay.
And yeah, 10 years ago. And I talked to her 9 years ago. So
I mean, it is professionally, reputationally costly to be the person to tattletale, on other people.
Yeah.
So you also get perks sometimes if you're right about it. Like the data colada guys, I think, are pretty respected by people.
Yes, they are. But so I'm telling this story like how science sucks. But it's great too. This is why I'm talking to you. This is why we're in the game. But you hear things and things. It's a human enterprise and it's a social enterprise. And so sometimes, for example, like just concretely, like you'll see, I don't know, there's like a trash paper and it's in Nature. And it's in Nature because the last author, blah, 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 blah. But the paper itself is trash. Like there are cases where it's like, okay, this paper should be in a very low impact factor. It's not fraudulent, but this is not a real Nature paper sometimes. But it's like statistically, or it's sophisticated enough that outsiders would think it was a Nature paper. And so those are the kind of things that's like makes me always suspicious when people are like, well, it's in a high impact journal, because it's like, if it's not my field, I don't really know if it should be in a high impact journal, because a lot of times it shouldn't. And later it turns out that like, oh, the science paper had like massive problems. And well, it's because, I mean, it's a glam journal, and, glam PIs, glam professors go to it, and they can get away with stuff. They can push stuff.
There are like at least two things that are going to predict a really impressive package of studies or really impressive results. That is, you have really impressive results, or you made up really impressive results. And it's really hard to actually find very impressive results because scientists have been doing science for a long time, and there's not a whole lot of new stuff to discover, at least in, disciplines that aren't totally changing their methodological procedures these days. So you probably do get more fraudulent papers than the top tier. You get better papers, but you also get more fraudulent papers and more p-hack papers. And if I recall, I do believe there was, an analysis of replicability in social psychology, or maybe it was psychology journals, and impact factor. And I don't think the better ones were more replicable. I'm not sure if the worst ones were more replicable or if it was just completely random. Some of the top ones were the lowest in replicability. And again, because like if you're going to get published in one of these top tier journals, you have to be so perfect across so many studies, and the odds of that happening naturally are pretty low. And so people, file draw some studies, and they do some like little subtle p-hacking thing, and then they get their paper in JPSP, and then 5 years later people can't replicate the results because you got lucky once, file drawed a bunch of other studies.
Yeah. So let's talk about censorship in science. So you have a preprint scientific censorship by scientists, and it's got a bunch of authors, as we talked about before we were recording. But this is an interesting topic. So you have a taxonomy in the paper, hard versus soft. When we think of censorship.
Oh, that paper. I thought we were talking about the taboos paper. This totally changes. That's okay, though.
Okay.
I talked about the taboos paper in that paper, so it'll be fine. Yeah, hard versus soft. Yeah, well, we kind of define so when you think about scientific censorship, the sort of, I guess, first thing that comes to mind is like governments trying to censor scientists, or like you think about Galileo, like scientists suffering truly horrible consequences for their inquiry. But that's not what's going on in the US today. Like a lot of the censorship you see is actually peers causing their peers to self-censor by like intimidation and like threats of, I might try to ostracize you, or I might call you out on Twitter, or get a petition to get your paper retracted or get you fired, or all of these more, they're like, not as big of a deal consequences, but they're still a big enough deal that a lot of scientists are self-censoring, and they avoid studying certain topics. They specifically avoid trying to find certain conclusions that aren't going to be friendly to the sort of left-leaning academia. And yeah, so the soft censorship is just these sort of like more subtle fear of consequences, where people avoid topics because they're afraid of like social consequences that they're going to get from their peers.
Yeah, and that, I feel like the soft censorship is actually okay. I don't actually know if this is true, but it seems like it's a bigger deal now than it was, say, 40 or 50 years ago, because the viscosity of like, it's like information flows much faster immediately at the speed of light on social media. Emails are being, I mean, think about like, in the 1970s, very few people had email. You had to call someone, you had to write a letter to them. Maybe you got involved in a collaboration that, if there was Twitter, they'd be like, you can't collaborate with that person, they're bad. I mean, I'm just trying to think of like how people, the things that I have seen, like how people would have done some of the things that I've seen them do back in the era before computers and, conferences and calling people up and writing letters.
Yeah, it would have been much harder. You can't just like start a petition and post it on Twitter and then get 1,400 signatories in 48 hours and intimidate somebody into doing whatever it is you want them to do. So I think like the fact that people can coordinate much easier on social media makes people do these kinds of sort of like vigilante censorship moves where they think they know what's right and they want to get a paper retracted or a person fired, or they don't want someone to get hired or whatever it is. They can go out and get a big enough group together that's going to put pressure on whatever it is, the administration or the department chair, the editor of the journal. So that's happening. There's also this direct contact between scientists and everyday people that I think you didn't have before, which is also happening on social media. So now all these everyday people are seeing scientific findings and reacting to them, and they're not, maybe trained in how you're supposed to interpret scientific findings, and you don't just leap to the worst possible application when you read a finding you don't like. And then the third one is just in this other paper, I see pretty big differences between men and women and among psychology professors and their endorsement of these kinds of behaviors. And women are much more supportive of, retracting papers or punishing scholars or ostracizing scholars if you don't like, if you think their scientific findings are like morally dubious.
Wait, I think I saw the figure on social media. Wait, what was the proportion difference
Of what?
Men and women, men versus women.
Oh, I have a lot of different questions. So, like, for example, there was one which was if pursuit of truth and social equity goals came into conflict, which should scientists prioritize? And men say truth, and women say it's complicated. Those are the most common responses. If I do, should scholars be free to pursue research questions without fear of punishment? like, or should scholars be able to do that? Men say yes, women say it's complicated. If I say, imagine a scholar forwards this controversial conclusion, what should happen to him or her? Most people just say like nothing other than criticism, but women are more likely to support pretty much everything. So they're more likely to say we should ostracize them, we should call them names on social media, we shouldn't hire them even if they meet typical standards, we shouldn't publish their papers even if they meet typical standards of merit at the journal, those kinds of things. So the fact that women are now dominating academia at all levels, and especially in the social sciences, and they have these very different standards for, what science should be doing, and they specifically are more likely to think science should be pursuing like what is morally good, and then scientific findings that don't pursue something morally good, we don't need them, like too risky, get rid of them. So I think those three things, the social media and how quickly people can, amass a crew of people to put pressure on institutions, the fact that scientists are interacting directly with people, like on podcasts, for example, and then the fact that we have more women in science are like a combined series of changes over the past 20 years that have created conditions where a lot of scientists are afraid to study certain topics or say what they believe is empirically true. And we have data on this. Almost all scientists are reluctant to say what they believe is empirically true, at least some of the time.
And so, is this explaining some differences? Is this explaining some differences between disciplines then in terms of censoriousness already? Like, would we be able to see this? Like, say, psychology versus engineering. I mean, I don't know what engineers would. I don't know, like nuclear engineers, like nuclear power, nuclear weapons. This is a whole thing. DoD contracts. I mean, it could be a whole thing.
There are a lot of correlated factors. So it is true. Like, for example, FIRE has been keeping track of cases of scholars who've been targeted for their research or teaching. And scholars are more likely to be targeted in the social sciences and humanities than they are in the hard sciences. But there are two things happening there. One is the social sciences and humanities often touch on topics that people care about more, even if you might say maybe they should care more about like the potential for nuclear war. They care about stuff like sexism and racism. But then also women are more likely to be employed in those disciplines. So it's I don't know which one's more responsible for that. Probably both. I don't know which one, if either is more than the other, but yeah, they're like, you don't even hear that much in the social sciences about gain of function research, for example, and concerns about that. It's all like, could this research finding spread negative stereotypes about a vulnerable group of people? Like, that's a really big concern to some people in the social sciences. So,
yeah, I mean, and so this is why I think viewpoint diversity, and Jonathan Haidt's been talking about it, because like, who is vulnerable? Like, I mean, let's say like we find out that evangelical Christians are less intelligent than the rest of the population on average. I think most people in academia would say they're not vulnerable, like they have power, But if you talk
they
to
would just say, "Who cares? Like, it's the truth. Publish it."
Yeah, but evangelical Christians, they're not. I mean, they're not. I mean, there are some in academia. They tend to keep a low profile.
Yeah.
But they're not excited about that finding. And they'll argue with you. Well, actually, there's like going to be some reason. You know what I'm saying? Like, well, did you like check Calvinists? Maybe they're smarter. People are always like, I think like a lawyer friend is like, it's arguing the hypothetical, where it's like you can, do a hypothetical counter argument and like kind of like, logic chop your way. But so I always feel like these ideas of harm reduction, it's like a whom question about who's the in group and out group, right?
Yeah, or even like, do not all people consider this thing to be harm in the first place? Some people might say, if you lower support for immigration, that's a harm. Other people would say, no, that's good. So yeah, like, who's controlling the scientific decision making? And yeah, right now it's mostly people on the left. I mean, plenty of people have argued for the viewpoint diversity. I'm not like persuaded that would be particularly helpful. You would just have more conflict and probably more people trying to censor more stuff. Like, what I would prefer is, let's keep the activism and the science separate. And like, I even think it maybe would be a good idea to try to split some scientific disciplines up into people who are like, no, I'm like a descriptive scientist. I say what is true. And then other people are like, I take science and I try to make the world a better place with that science. Because when the two are like operating at the same time, you can distort the truth because you don't find a particular finding to be, socially helpful. And then that can undermine trust in the whole institution of science, which is already happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's happened a lot in the last 10 years. The polls are just crazy, but they're not
Mhm.
shocking. And I remember a lot of the listeners will know Heather McDonald, a friend of mine. I remember in 2010, it was 2010, 2011. I had just started graduate school. And I remember she was saying that, can we trust these scientists and stuff like that? And I was just like, well, they're all liberal, but, they're not like activists like in women's studies or something like that, And
Well, who are you talking about? Some of them are activists.
Well, they are now.
I'm sure some of them were then. Probably
They
more
were,
of
but like
them are now.
but the social norms were different in terms of, well, it's like now it's basically like you can't even
people
be a
will just
conservative in some
say,
fields.
that. But they'll also just say out loud, like, I'll have reviewers just say, I'm worried how this finding could undermine liberals' noble agenda to do X. And like the fact that they're willing to say that in the review,
Yeah.
that tells you something. They think it's totally legitimate to criticize a paper because they don't like the political implications of it. Whereas I think 10, 15 years ago, if scientists had that concern, they'd at least try to hide it. Right?
They would mask it. Like they would give a different rush. They would
Be
give
a
a
good
different.
scientist and lie to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, the issue is like, you do have to put a pretense on certain things sometimes, just to maintain the vigor and the rigor of an institution. So let's say, like I will defend the masking in a way, because if you have the pretense of objectivity, you're still going to draw in many more people who are interested in objectivity. So I can tell you for a fact, I know young scientists who are leaving the field, are leaving academia, and it's because of the culture of academia, not because of the science, because it's like they have to look at themselves and like think like, do I care about the science, or like to like endure these people candidly,
Yeah.
And it's because of this like massive politicization that's happening, the constant activism. A lot of these people are not themselves even very conservative or anything like that, but there's like no space for people that just, let's just talk about the science and not, get obsessed with like, whatever, DEI requirement for the department now and all these other things. And, oh, there's another anti-Israel petition and I'm going to look bad if I don't sign the anti-Israel petition, like these sorts of things. They wear on people. But what happens is the people that aren't interested in that leave.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the department is all people into activism. They're like monoculture, and then what's going on? Like then what happens? I don't know. In terms of like what the face of the field is. I mean, and I said this on social media, so I'll say this on the podcast because whatever. I have a friend and he just left academia. I'll tell you, he's a white male, okay? But he's been on faculty searches, and he was just one day he was like, he's like, I really think faculty searches, it's almost like dating. White women don't like Asian men. Like it's like all like he's just like they're very consistently negative, and it's not really racism, but it's like a lot of these Asian guys, especially if they're from Asia, they don't know all this DEI stuff. They don't know what to say. They don't know, like they kind of try sometimes. They've obviously been coached, but it's not natural. And so the culture divergence is massive between those two groups is the way I would explain it. But like, my friend was in a hard science. He was not even in a social science. But the demographics, he's saying like if you look at the young faculty, the activists are reproducing themselves now. And people like him are leaving, and they put like really strong vetoes on people that aren't enthusiastic enough about diversity in politics. And he's in an applied life sciences, okay? It's not like he's in social science or anything like that. And so you're creating this group of people that basically agree on everything.
Yeah.
And I don't see a way out of this equilibrium. And in terms of like self-censorship and soft self-censorship, the problem with that is it's soft, it's less visible. I mean, like, you can
Exactly.
go to a granting it, yeah.
You often can't see it at all, and so it's easy for people to deny that it's even happening, which is why I've been trying to collect the data on it to be like, look, it's happening, people. But I have mixed feelings about it. Like, I mentor some younger folks, and the ones that aren't super woke, when they're young, they're already having a hard time because they don't necessarily agree with everything that's being said in a seminar, and if they open their mouth, then they're immediately ostracized from everyone else. And then when I'm trying to advise people, like, should you stay in academia? Should you try to get a job, at a university? On the one hand, I don't want to contribute to the problem and people becoming even more like the population of academics becoming even more activist. But on the other hand, it's a pretty unpleasant place to be if you're not in that club. I'm not in that club. And like when I go to conferences, I'm like on the verge of a panic attack the whole time. And I just like mostly look for a couple people that I'm friends with, talk to them, and then get the hell out of there because like I know a lot of them hate me. And part of me is like, well, maybe we should just let them have it. And then all of these other institutions are popping up. You're going to have think tanks and, different kinds of startups. And organizations that are like, hey, if we can get the funding, we can do science too. We don't need to be at a university to do it. And then we can get rid of all this extra bullshit that goes along with it. So maybe that will happen. That would be quite interesting. And then the academics will have some competition to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very highly funded institution, though. I mean, the academia as a whole, I mean, for now, so,
Yeah.
It's really hard.
They have students paying a lot of money.
For now, yeah, we'll see how much longer this goes on. So I do think a little bit of the monoculture is one of the reasons that they're like being they're getting a little taken aback by people on the right going at the institution because they're like, we're sacrosanct, they expected the signatures to last forever and ever because money grows on trees, and it's a little bit of a bubble, and the bubble existed partly to cultivate independence and intellectual inquiry. But if that's not happening, no one has the buy-in. It's not like scientists have ever been like the population. They're like a lot. They've always been more atheists. They've always been more liberal, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a price. The people that were not of that persuasion, they were willing to pay to fund this stuff because science is important. But now, if you're not even doing science that's important, science that's objective, science that's producing real results, then the whole enterprise is going to fail. So let's talk about adversarial collaborations. So you have it's a preprint, or no, it's a paper, it's out.
I have a few papers on adversarial collaborations, but yeah, essentially, for those of you who aren't aware of the sort of typical norms of publishing scientific papers, well, first, like the big incentive is like you have to say something new and exciting that differentiates you from everyone who came before you, and then you have to convince employers that you have this novel idea, and then that becomes your identity, and then you spend the rest of your career defending it. A lot of the time, not all the time. And so what typically happens with disagreement is, a scholar forwards some theory and they become sort of, academia famous for that theory. Another scholar comes along and says, I have this new one that's totally different from that guy. And here's how, and here's my data. And then they just debate each other for years or decades. And it almost never happens that these two decide to work together and actually get to the bottom of what's going on. And they both just continue to pump out more and more data that supposedly supports their side of these supposedly contradictory theories. And it just creates all of this chaos in the scientific literature where there are, I would guess, maybe, well, I probably shouldn't put a number on it, but tons of academic papers have other academic papers contradicting them. And we almost never get to the bottom of them, or at least the people who are forwarding these papers almost never get to the bottom of them. And then like sometimes they die and we kind of figure it out. But the adversarial collaboration idea is just, we need to hold scientists to a higher standard and say, if you're going to be publishing research that contradicts another scholar, the first thing you should do is, call that person up and say, hey, this is so odd. Like, let's figure out what's going on here and work together, and then forward a more a perspective that actually accounts for all of the data. And typically what you find, and this is what I've been finding in all of the adversarial collaborations I've been doing, is you end up with just like more nuanced claims. You know, neither side's big, broad, like super impressive claim is right 100% of the time. It's like this person's right in this small way, and this person's right in this small way. And so a lot of these apparent contradictions aren't even contradictions. It's just both scholars are incentivized to frame their findings as excessively broad and important.
Well, I mean, yeah, and it's interesting. You're talking about like these contradictory findings or whatever in the literature, supposedly, and when someone says studies show or there's a study, I mean, it's kind of a punchline now because you just find the opposite study, and it's so it like lacks. I mean, if you're in the field, you kind of know, or you could like, look at like who's being cited and how, but even then that's not necessarily, valid. And so it basically like just undermines the whole purpose of having the academic literature. If it's just like filled with all these people like talking up cross purposes, no one knows what's going on,
Yeah, people are like, trust the science. And it's like, well, which science?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of science that says the opposite thing too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that's funny. Like even scientists will say that. I'm like, you do know, like you more than anyone understand what science looks like. It's a mess. Like we've discovered some things, but a lot of stuff is a mess.
It's a form of Gell-Mann amnesia. That thing you read a paper and it's in your field and everything is wrong in a journal, but then you read about like some international thing or another field, you're like, oh, I didn't know that, and so it's like within science, it's like, oh yeah, who cares if that's in PNAS or whatever. This is why it's wrong, and like these stats are shady. Oh, they didn't change their parameter values in the model, and all of this like stuff you just like jumps out at you as like suspicious. And then you read this. I read an awesome paper about the distribution of wildebeest in Africa, and like the maps are very beautiful, and I know so much more about why there's so many of them in Tanzania now, but like I don't really know if I know that, because like they're telling a good story. That's what you're taught, right? You're told to tell a good story. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not a postmodernist, obviously. I think knowledge and truth can be attainable. I think replication, using a common language is actually a big deal. In terms of like economists have a certain formal mathematical language, and so they can talk to each other really fast, and they can double check and cross-reference each other. I think some of the problems in the more descriptive fields is like, well, what do you do to like cross-check their interpretation, or like, are you going to go live among this tribe yourself? Because like the way they like summarize their findings sometimes in some parts of cultural anthropology are just like so impressionistic that I don't even know what to say about this. I mean, they're not like measuring like, how many sticks they have, like, or whatever, spears, and, and so, the method, the language, like a lot of these things can make it clearer. But I think one of the things we're getting at here with adversarial collaborations, this idea, what are we here for? Like, what are we actually doing? And I do worry that sometimes science. So I saw this guy on social media, as we see people on social media, and he's a statistical geneticist. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not a big fan of his for various reasons. I'm not a big fan of his mentor. They're bullies, whatever. But I pay attention to him because I know he's a bully. I know he's from a bully's lab, like, and there's bully behavior that they all do. And he said the reason I am in the field of statistical genetics is because of the community. And I'm just like, no. That should not be why you're in a field of science, because of the community. If you want to be part of a community, go join an NGO, go join a church, go join a lodge. Yeah, like just like there are communities out there. Like the reason that you are studying statistical genetics is to know statistical genetics. It's not to go to the conference and go to the parties or, be like supported in whatever issue you have in your life. And so maybe this is gendered. He's obviously, I mean, I'm using a he, him pronoun for him. It's a dude. But the way he was speaking, I just wanted to scream because I was like, this is the problem. This is the problem. You're forgetting why you're doing this. You're forgetting why you're foregoing a private sector job and spending your life, submitting papers to journals that very few people read. You're doing it because you care about the truth.
Well, I mean, ideally, I think most scientists will tell you that they're in science to pursue truth, and that's what they care about. They care about science. They care about the truth. But how much of that is actually true? I mean, science is a sort of like status system, and people want to get status within their community. They want to get cited, and they want to get in the prestigious journals, and they want to win awards. And like, do they care more about publishing true information, or do they care more about publishing fancy papers that get them a lot of attention and praise? Like, I don't know. I would guess it's at least 50-50,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, well, that's part of the adversarial collaboration is to try to, part of it is to kind of try to shift the incentives. I want people to respect people who participate in adversarial collaborations because it demonstrates a commitment to truth and a willingness to update your beliefs, even if it contradicts something you published before. But also, my like long-term hope is that if these became super normal, people were doing them all the time, and it became normal for scientists to update their beliefs and say, I published this paper before and I made this broad claim and it was a little bit too broad. Now I believe that in this context it's true, but not over here. And over here, this other thing is true. And instead of that being like reputationally damaging, we could be like, good job. Like, we're proud of you for changing your mind.
Yeah.
Like, if people could get status for that instead of for digging in their heels and being like, my theory is the best theory and it's the right one and everyone who disagrees with me is a fucking idiot. Sorry, am I allowed to say the F word?
You are.
An idiot. Okay. Instead of like giving those people all of the awards, give the awards to the people who like make these contributions to science and they increase over time and they change their minds when they should. And then if that really became the thing we like rewarded scientists for, more people would do it. They don't do it because people try to shame each other when they get something wrong. They try to humiliate each other, like when a paper fails to replicate. And like, maybe they should in cases of you probably p-hacked. But if it was just a sincere mistake or something, then maybe like people shouldn't be so judgy of those people. And that's just not the way things are right now.
Yeah, so
But-
let me give an empirical example of like is how incentives matter. This is a repeated issue that has happened in science. So the president, I think he's the president of Stanford, just resigned because of some issues with fraud. And this goes back 20 years. He's a big dude. He's a very, very influential scholar. But it goes, there's problems in his lab repeatedly. And one of the issues that came up, and this is an issue in fraud that has come up repeatedly, is a lot of...
I thought they said he didn't commit fraud, but he made like a really bad mistake.
I think that there was fraud in some of the papers of his juniors, but that he didn't bring it to light or something. You know what I'm saying? Like he himself, I'm actually pretty sure he himself probably did not commit any fraud. And did not knowingly sign on to fraud. So, just to cover myself from libel, there are allegations of fraud by his against people who work for him. But what he did, which this has happened before, in these labs, is he has a system where it's basically sink or swim for the postdocs, and the postdocs that produce the good results are the postdocs that go up and they get good recommendations, and the postdocs don't produce good results are out. Okay, so what are the incentives then?
I've heard of mentors like that where they praise the person who gets these totally implausibly significant findings, and then like they're their star student, and then meanwhile these other ones who are just like working hard and doing a lot of studies but they're not getting significant results are like neglected. And yeah, I think it's not a good environment if what you care about is figuring out what's true.
And this has happened. I mean, this like in life science, biomedical science, there's some famous cases of like manufactured figures and stuff that was touched up and all this, all of these issues, and they come out of labs that are extremely competitive, and the incentive then is to produce by any means possible, right? And so I think that's something. I don't know what the solution is, because you want people to be competitive. You want people to do the best they can, because otherwise they're not going to do anything. And there are different academic cultures in different countries. I have a friend who is from Italy, and she didn't want to go. She has like a job offer in Italy, but she didn't want to go back because they also told her, like,
Mm.
look, if you come back to Italy, you're not going to work that much. Like, literally, like, we're going to get mad at you if you work too much.
What does that mean?
They don't pay them that much, so they don't work that much. And so the culture in
They'll get
those
mad at you if you work too.
yeah.
I was an assistant professor in England for a couple of years, and they didn't expect you to work that much, but they wouldn't get mad at you if you worked a lot.
Well, because the issue is you, because they said, look, we know, we looked at your publication record, it's impressive. If you come over and like just keep publishing because you work a lot, then we're gonna look bad, you know. And so they were just like, if you're willing to, like, yeah, they were straight up about it. Yeah, no, they were straight up about it. And like, I totally find it plausible because I have a friend who is in the National Police in the Carabinieri, and he got the same actually feedback because he's a very diligent worker. Yeah, he got a call from Roma, and they were just like, you know, the guy was like, look, you do a good job, but you know, people have been like talking about you that you know, you're out there working, solving crimes. I mean, I don't know what I mean, like, imagine a town. Yeah, it was like weird stuff. And then like, I still remember this. He said,
"It's gonna be a libel case against Italy."
No, but he said, look, he said, like, don't exert yourself. You know, he's like, I've been police officer for 40 years. The only time I exert myself at work is when I'm on the toilet. I was like, what does that even mean? You know, I mean, like, get some roughage into your system, bro. But yeah, like, there's weird things like that, and that's just a culture. It's a culture. Like in the United States, the culture in academia is publish or perish. Don't get murdered
in Italy, is what you're saying.
Well, I mean, or like, you know, as what's her name? I forget her name now, but you know, don't be adjacent to someone that murders someone, or you might get in prison, right? But I mean, you know, because you know, the justice system. But here in the United States, we have, like, I think, an opposite problem, where people work really hard, and to be candid, like, I don't understand why some people at Research 2 universities are working so hard on research. Because,
well, I think, you know, they like it, like research. Well, you know, different professors like being in academia for different reasons. Some really love to teach a lot, some love to mentor, even some love admin. But like, I think for a lot of people, the research is their favorite part. And so they're willing to put in overtime in that domain. But yeah, no, it is true. The expectations are really quite high in the US. And I've known, you know, grad students who will pull all-nighters to get grants in. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, maybe we're overdoing it a little bit, but
well, so Richard, I want to actually, like, end, because like, with the evolution of relentless badassery, because I like the title. Okay,
thank you.
But
that was all me.
that does seem like you. But you know, it lacks dignity. No, but I do want to say, so you know, Dick Hanania, online shitster, he has a funny story.
Do people call him Dick?
I'm trying to make Dick happen.
Okay.
But,
I'm on board with that.
But he has a funny story, and I've heard this story before, like this sort of story, like not the exact details, but the general. Just someone at a mid-tier Research 1 university, and canceled academic, and or, you know, and so one of the graduate students was like, she was like, you know, I like you, but like, we can't be seen talking to you because that will jeopardize our career opportunities. And he was thinking,
talking to him.
Yes, talking to him. And the guy who was canceled was thinking he didn't have the heart to tell her that she's at a mid-tier R1 university. She has no career opportunities.
Mid-tier R1 is okay. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what your department is. I don't know the deal. It has to be social science if the guy was talking to Richard. But the point is, there are universities where the faculty went to Harvard.
Yeah.
You know, and the graduate students, okay, they'll be lucky. I mean, except for a few exceptions, most of the graduate students, if they stay in academia, are going to be at a considerably lower rank. And so this whole system is a little bit of a Ponzi scheme in a way.
That's true.
And I don't know, but I've heard stuff like that from professors where they're like, you know, like, I don't even know why I have graduate students, because like they're not competitive with people, you know, And so like,
Yeah.
what's going on here? What am I doing? But whatever. So evolution of relentless badassery. Like, what's the deal with this?
So
Like,
that
what was this a bet? Did you have a bet to write a paper with this title?
No, it was we were invited to write a chapter for the book is called The Godfather and Philosophy. And I had this theory about like error management and how it applies to blaming people. And essentially, like, if you don't blame someone when you should have, then you're a sucker. You're like the idiot who doesn't get revenge, and you become a target. But if you punish people when no one deserves to be punished, then you're a badass like Don Corleone from The Godfather, and like people are scared of you. And so we were essentially arguing that people should have evolved a bias toward punishing and blaming people when maybe they shouldn't. And that's the Don Corleone principle. And then we talk about the evolution of Michael as a relentless badass and how he comes
Mhm.
to accept this principle over the course of the Godfather series.
Yeah, I mean, I do think The Godfather is. I mean, I think especially the first couple movies. I think it's very interesting because there's. I don't know if it's purposeful or it's because of directing. There's a lot of like social and cultural depth to them in terms of what they illustrate about social and cultural dynamics. I think one of the most interesting ones to me is that scene where a man's daughter has been raped,
Mm.
and you know what scene, and he comes to the Godfather, and he just like he like goes on this like little bit of a rant that you're a respectable person, and normally you wouldn't give me the time of day, and now like you interrupt me on the day of my daughter's wedding
Yeah.
because you want me to commit you want violence committed against this man.
You don't
you
offer
know
me friendship.
yeah, and it was just like the whole thing was like, whoa, there's like some serious stuff going on here, and it's like legit true. And then of course he's like, okay, like it'll be done, like leave or whatever, and the guy's like, thank you, Godfather. And so
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting because there's a whole theory of these sorts of behaviors where it's actually just like what the early state was like, and the mafia does come out of parastate institutions. The state was weak, the localities were weak in parts of southern Italy, and the mafia emerged as in the anarchy that ensued to take over state like roles. And so I think it's interesting. Films like The Godfather, yes, they're entertaining, but I think one reason that they appeal to us is there are a lot of conventional dynamics operative in a criminal context.
Yeah,
You
and
know?
when you can't rely on institutions to handle those kinds of things, which for most of human history there were no institutions to depend upon, then you would want to be loyal to someone who could, get your justice for you and, you know, give them status so that they'll be on your side.
Yeah. And I do think, with the Pinker idea of the decline of violence, which is like an empirical observation, right? It's interesting that people that are badasses are kind of, I mean, I'm saying this word, but those people, like, I think we're much more ambivalent about them
Yeah.
now, because they can cause a lot of damage. And also, like, you don't want, you don't, like, okay, let's say your friend is bullied. I don't know the details today, but it's like, I think like violent retribution on your part is going to cause problems for you.
Right.
Like the authorities will come after you because what they don't want vendettas, cycles
Right.
of vendettas and stuff like that. So it's a different social equilibrium. So the evolution of this characteristics culturally, biologically, cognitively, could be a holdover from this earlier time when it was
Right.
necessary. Just like, if you have like total transparency in your institutions, you don't need constant cheating detection.
Right.
So I mean, these are things that are gonna change, and as the United States becomes less and less violent, let's hope it stays, not super violent, and we don't get into any big wars. I think this sort of Michael type character will seem more and more strange. And when you read the Iliad, like it's like in the beginning, Achilles, yeah, he's having a dispute because he had his sex slave taken away. You know, like think about what's going on here. You know, he killed her brother, and he killed her father, and he enslaved her. You know, and she was his, like, you know, sex slave. And Agamemnon was mad, and he took it. You know, and like that is like the cause. That is like the injustice in that. You know, and it's like, but you know, to the ancient Greeks, it totally made
Yeah.
it totally, you know, like, how dare you, sir? You know, I didn't even buy her. I actually stole her after killing her family. You know, so. I mean, we're laughing because it's like absurd,
Yeah.
but I do think like these sorts of commentaries are interesting because.
But I do think something like with The Godfather in the case, like I think you're right. Like it'll seem, you know, even when I talk about this sort of like theory, like, you know, we respect people who are punitive and vindictive because we're sort of afraid of them, and you know, we don't want to cross them. But you know, even when I talk about that, people are like, no, like we hate people who are really, you know, hotheads and these kind of people. But I think, yeah, it's like a product of our culture where those temperaments or personality traits are no longer valuable. But you could imagine in a world where all of a sudden we didn't have the institutions we had, like how quickly would it go right back to that? I think probably in almost no time at all. Like, I don't know if you've ever been in a sort of like emergency situation, but I've been like at a gas station when a hurricane was hitting, and like all civility goes out the window. Like everyone's like, every man for himself. Like, we're not polite, we're not waiting in lines, there's no norms, there are no rules. It's just, you know, get what you can and get out. So I think in certain circumstances, these psychological tendencies are there. It's just like you need the right situation to bring them out.
Yeah. Right situation, and like, you know, the groups that adapt to the new situations will also do better, you know, institutionally, you know, in terms of when there's anarchy, you know, I mean,
to find the leader, you got to get with your group, you got to coordinate. Sometimes you got to be violent.
Yeah. So, like, what do you look into for the future as we wind down now? I'm just curious, like, what's your biggest project that you're focused on right now?
I've got a lot. One that I like a lot that I'm finishing up right now looks at how politicization undermines trust towards institutions. And the cool thing we see is that both people on the left and right don't trust institutions that are politicized, even if they're on the left or right. So even liberals hate when liberal institutions get political, and even conservatives hate when conservative institutions get political. And we see this spreads out too. Like skepticism toward them, willingness to support them financially, willingness to defer to their expertise. It's just negative across the board. And then we even see, like, if you have a sub-institution, or sub-organization, so we have like a fake organization called like Economics Professors of America. And if they have like a Democrat or Republican speaker at their convention, not only do people trust Economics of Professors of America less, they trust all economists less, and they don't want to defer to economists in general. So like you can have this one little group get involved in politics, and they sort of represent the whole broader professional group and screw it up for everyone. So yeah, I didn't expect to see such big effects even when it was an in-group institution. I expected to definitely see it when it's an out-group institution, but nobody likes it, which I guess then my next project has to be like, why do organizations and institutions constantly get involved in politics when it's harming their reputation with the public in a pretty big way, so far as I can tell?
Well, I mean, but that's the iron law of institutions, right? Where it's like in-group institutional status is different than the institutional effectiveness and the institution's status, right? So I mean, I guess like I'll just make an observation as I'm closing out. Is like, you know, I have been warning scientists that you know, going like, you know, mask off, like, you know, we want to put, you know, our political enemies, you know, like, you know, on the street or whatever, you know, I mean, sometimes more extreme. It can make you seem badass to your in-group, you know, but other people are watching.
Yeah.
And the affected. So, for example, like, let's talk about public health during the pandemic.
Yep.
Like there started to be a bidding war of like how like hardcore you were, I think, in a lot of ways. And then there was also during BLM, all of a sudden the mask and the public gathering opposers just flipped for political reasons, and they signed a petition like, we believe the social justice, blah blah blah, all this stuff, right? Well, I mean, the ones who didn't sign up, they were in trouble. They were being attacked within the institution. But actually, everyone knows that totally destroyed the broader public acceptance of that whole field. In terms of like, no conservative was ever going to take anything they said seriously ever again, because when it came to like a political signal, they were totally like as one.
Right. Yeah. There's the question of like, so take a social psychologist, for example. They could do some far lefty thing, and maybe they undermine the credibility of social psychology among the public, maybe even among the left-leaning public. But do they get a lot of credit among the left-leaning social psychologists, which is their most immediate in-group? And that's all they care about. They don't care if they undermine social psychology. They care about their own self rising through the ranks of their like smaller. But I do wonder. So like when I presented this at a talk, I have the slide, if you use it, you lose it. Like, I do wonder if people use their positions of authority within these institutions that have power and influence in order to push a political agenda. And sure, that gets them status within their community. But in so doing that, they undermine the status of their community. And so the group of people that they want to have power like among, that group might itself fall down a few tiers. And so the thing that you were trying to accomplish is actually not worth as much as it was before you did the thing that you did. So it's like, is it actually a rational move? I don't know. But that's also a relevant question, of course. Like, what are people trying to accomplish, and what are they actually accomplishing?
I mean, I think this is I think it's a coordination problem. It's a coordination problem because if everyone's on the same page of like trying to stay above board, the institution has high status, and you gain out of that. But I mean, this is like an economic game where it's, there are societies where, people are competing, and then everyone is poor, right? So it's like this, there's, we could do like game theory, Nash equilibrium, whatever. There's all sorts of things going on here. But yes, what you're alluding to is the pie gets so small that the winner is poorer than they would have been if they were the loser in the within institution game.
Right. And is that a better outcome for them because they only care about their relative status compared to their immediate peers? Or, I guess if they could somehow climb the status hierarchy without doing that and tanking the institution's reputation, that would be preferable, I would think. But maybe it's not possible. I don't know. But yeah, so maybe that's where I'll go in the future. If any of your listeners have ideas or interesting questions, please, I don't know, you can email me or something.
Yeah, I'll put well, all the contact info will be in the show notes. So,
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of different interests. It's cool. I always enjoy talking to you. Have not talked to you as much as I should. So I'm glad that I got to catch up. Maybe we'll see each other IRL at some point at a conference or something like that. I'm flying around the country doing biz dev, guys. So, if you have money, I'm raising for my startup, and I will take selfie with you. If that's what needs to be done.
I'm looking for it at the Adversarial Collaboration Project too. Give it to me instead of Razib.
Well, okay.
We all need money.
She wants a grant. I'm offering equity that might return. So
I'll do selfies. I'll buy you an old fashioned.
All right. So this is now we're getting into a competition, and I think a selfie with you would be more valuable.
I'm cuter. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I think a selfie with you would be more valuable. So okay, I think we're gonna end it here because we don't want the institution's reputation to drop any further.
Yeah. Wise.
All right. Yeah. All right. Take it easy.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast for kids